Here with us now is Florida Senator Marco Rubio. He spoke at the convention on Tuesday. He was also on Trump's vice presidential shortlist. The two ran against each other during the 2016 cycle. Senator Rubio, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
You sat next to Donald Trump last night in the VIP box. How's he doing?
I think he's very impressed by the convention. I think very touched, but very impressed by the production of it, the quality of the people. I was with him when the Gold Star families were up, and you know, I'm not sure if he had seen that video before, but he seemed really impacted by it. Everybody that saw that was about those 13 families and what happened in Afghanistan. So, and I'm prepared for what's going to be a very good speech tonight. I really do. I think it's going to connect what this movement's always been about to everyday people's lives, which is really what the movement's always been about, is that what he calls the forgotten men and women. But I think he's going to describe it tonight in a way that really is going to resonate, and that is, these are people that maybe don't agree on this or that or the other, but they all want the same thing for their lives and for the country, and they feel like for a long time their leaders were just ignoring them or leaving them behind. And I think tonight, I hope, my sense is that they're going to really try to lay that out there as to that's what this movement's always been about.
You're a leader, of course, on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and I want to ask you about J.D. Vance, who is the vice presidential nominee. On the issue of Ukraine, he has said, I don't care one way or another about Ukraine. Are you concerned about that?
Well, I think J.D.'s point on Ukraine is that the United States has more important strategic threats that we need to confront. He's actually told me, we've talked about this quite extensively, he believes that we just can't afford to be diverted by what's happening in Ukraine because it doesn't compare to, for example, a potential threat in the Indo-Pacific region. And you know, that's an argument I listen to, and I do think we have reached an era in which we have to be more judicious, a little bit more realist about how we deploy U.S. power abroad, whether it's dollars or obviously troops. And military commitments, because the world has changed dramatically over the last time. We have a near-peer adversary now. The Chinese, in so many ways, are superior to the Soviet Union in terms of the threat they pose. They are an industrial threat, a military threat, an economic one. They're a real competitor. And so we can't afford, even if we wanted to be involved in every place on all things. We have to do a better job of separating between what we'd like to do and what we want to do. And it's really a return to a more realist foreign policy that, frankly, was the consensus in the Republican Party up until, probably the early 90s.
But the greatest military in the world is able to counter several threats at once. We have a strong naval presence in the Red Sea. I was there with an entire aircraft carrier strike group. We have an entire, of course, strong Navy as well in the South China Sea defending there. Can we not do two things at once?
Well, what's gotten more difficult about it is that the Chinese are a threat. They have asymmetrical threats. In essence, the ability to destroy an aircraft carrier with an anti-ship missile, that's a fraction of the cost of that aircraft carrier. The inability, if the Chinese can prove that the United States is not capable of intervening in a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, it's over. The Taiwanese are going to sue for peace, they're going to turn themselves over, and all of our allies in the region will figure out how to fit into this region now dominated by China. And so I think that's a different kind of threat for just how many ships we have or how many parts of the world we can be at physically, that we have to confront that. And the Chinese military capabilities continue to grow exponentially at the fastest rate of any military buildup since the 1930s. We've never seen that.
Joined here, as you see, by Margaret Brennan and Major Garrett.
Senator, you are in such a key role on Senate intelligence, and you've been very clear-eyed about describing adversaries like China and Russia. And it's a little bit jarring, frankly, to look over your shoulder and see Tucker Carlson behind you, who has been accused by some of your Republican counterparts of standing on and repeating Russian talking points about Ukraine. And I wonder what you think about this strain of isolationism in your party, as Mitch McConnell has put it. Mitch McConnell in an interview told me it's Tucker Carlson who started it.
Well, listen, there's always been a strain of American thought that we shouldn't be involved in as many places around the world. And there's always, foreign policy realism was a consensus position in the Republican Party up until about 94.
But this
even
was a
George
key
H.W.
position.
Well,
here
so
tonight.
Tucker, first of all, is a commentator and a very intelligent person, and he challenges orthodoxy. I mean, that is his calling card. And let me tell you something. I don't have to agree on Tucker on everything to understand that, one of the things that happens, if someone says to me, Russia's right about Ukraine, if somebody were to say that to me, I think that now is an obligation for someone like me to think about my arguments and figure out how to be able to counter that argument. And that's one of the things that's happened over the last few years is it's forced many of us that feel a certain way about some topic or another to really sort of revisit why it is we feel that way so we can better articulate it. But I also think we have to understand the world is not static. It's dynamic. It is constantly changing. The world looks very different today than it did 10 years ago. It just does, in terms of the threats and in terms of how many places we're now being pulled. And we can't afford to allow ourselves to be depleted. And we really have to, we've entered an era where we have to prioritize where in the world and how in the world we're going to get involved.
Senator Rubio, I'd like to talk to you about immigration. The former president promises the largest deportation operation in the history of our country on day one. There are signs on the floor that reflect that. In 2016, when I covered your campaign, I remember you skeptically saying he's not going to build the wall and Mexico's not going to pay for it. It's an overpromise. Do you have any fear that the former President Trump, on this mass deportation, which he often analogizes to something that Dwight Eisenhower did, which was, called Operation Wetback, is not going to work, is an overpromise, and carries a lingering aura of racism from that era?
No, first of all, let me say this. We have 10 million people, some number, that have entered the country illegally over the last 3.5 years. And that is on top of what already was here and already has been here from the past. That's number one. Number two, illegal immigration across the border, like we're seeing, is entirely incentive-based. In essence, people believe we can get there and we're going to be able to stay, and they're incentivized to come. When you create a disincentive, when you make them believe, when people believe it's going to be harder to get in and harder to stay if they do, less people will come. And that's not me saying it. Every country along that migration route will tell you that that's what the migrants are telling them on their way here, that they believe they can get and they can stay. Some of it's misrepresented. Some of it's just they know people that have been able to do it. Now, we will have to deport people. Okay, there are people in this country. I'll give you an example. The other day in Miami on Sunday, there was a big game between Colombia and Argentina. Thousands of people just sort of bum rushed the gate. They arrested a bunch of them, put everything in danger, and 17 or 20 of them are illegally in this country. My view is those people should be immediately deported. They're already here illegally. The same with people that we know are criminals. Some of these horrible crimes that have been committed by these gang members from Tren de Aragua, which is a Venezuelan street gang that's terrorized Peru, Ecuador. I mean, they've worked their way down. We've actually arrested some of these people for other crimes and released them again without deporting them. So there has to be some deportation, and you begin with the most dangerous elements of the country. No one says it's going to be easy, but we most certainly have to create a disincentive, or we're going to see more and more people coming and rates that are unsustainable for any country in the world. We already admit 1 million people a year legally. And then we're adding on top of that people that, frankly, you can't vet. You can't vet people from Central Asia.
But the president has said it will not just be those who are the most visible repeat criminals or criminals in this country. Everyone who came across illegally, that's what he's promising. Is that an overpromise?
Well, that's the law of the country.
I know, but you know the practical difficulties of that.
Well, do I think you can can you deport 10 million people in a month? Probably not. But I think I can tell you that you can begin to identify everyone who's in your jails and do them first. That would be your priority. And the second point is you have to make a strong effort to, our laws say the following. Our immigration laws are not complicated in that realm. It says if you are here illegally, you are to be detained until removal. And we have not detained and we have not removed. Now, there was always been exceptions. Okay, the Dalai Lama shows up at the border, saying they're going to Chinese want to kill me. We'd probably let him in. But the exceptions now become the rule. And that's the problem, and it's incentivizing people to come. We just can't do it. No country in the world can sustain that.
Is this something you would want to take on in a Trump administration?
Do what? What?
A position that would allow you in Homeland Security or intelligence to do one of these things?
Well, ultimately, that's up to the president to decide the team he wants around him. So I would think it's premature to talk about those things. We haven't even finished the convention yet. We still have an election to win, right?
Yes. I think the Dalai Lama can still get a visa, so he probably won't be.
Yeah, you're right. Well, maybe he wants to stay permanently. I don't know.
I have interviewed him before, yes. I think he can get a... let me ask you about one of the things that the president is going to be talking about tonight, and that is the assassination attempt. You were briefed by the Secret Service. What's your main concern? How big of a failure was this?
I think the Secret Service should be on TV every single day giving updates to the public. I think they should be giving you guys updates to the public.
We are asking.
When you don't do that, let me tell you what you create. We've been dealing with the JFK thing for how long? I mean, right? Yeah. You create the opening for conspiracy theories. Now, here's what we do know. There is no way in the world that some 20-year-old guy should be able to climb on top of a roof 150 yards away and take that shot. That should not have happened. Someone screwed up. We want to know who that is, but more importantly, we need to know, is there a systemic problem in the Secret Service? the Secret Service doesn't just protect presidents and candidates, they protect the country. If President Trump had been assassinated that night, I can't even imagine where our country would be right now. We would be in a very dangerous place. They protect our country. I'm grateful to the officers who jumped on that stage and what they did, but someone messed up in terms of the advancing of that event.
Some perhaps failure in communication as well, the people that did spot him. We are pressing on those issues. We've been reporting it every night on the CBS Evening News and across CBS. Senator Rubio, great to have you up here. We appreciate
Great being with you. And you guys are here in person and live.
It's great.
Yeah, some guys are not, so that's awesome.
Thank you to CBS. Yes.